Okay, so can everyone hear now? Yes. Well, welcome to all of you. I imagine that a number of you have bags under your eyes the way that I do, but I'm hoping that if we see some videos of cute children, that's about the best medicine for anything that ails you. So let me tell you a little bit about how and why I decided to write this book. I wanted to write a book about really exciting new science, both in evolutionary biology and in developmental psychology, that shows the way that children learn from caregivers and why relationships between caregivers and children evolved in the first place. And I started to write this, and at the same time, I became a grandmother of 3 gorgeous grandchildren, and I was plunged back into the world of caregiving. And I realized that even the 30 years between from the time that I had raised my own children, there was a lot more pressure and anxiety in this new kind of way of thinking about caregiving that affected parents, particularly middle-class parents like my son and daughter. And I think it can sort of be summed up in the very word parenting, which it turns out only appeared in the 1970s. And the picture is the picture of being a parent being kind of like being a carpenter. So the idea is that if you just buy the right apps and read the right books and get the right instruction and get the right expertise, you can shape your child into a particular good kind of child who's better or smarter or more successful than other children, and in turn that will shape that child into a better adult. So that's very much this picture, and there's tremendous pressure on parents and tremendous anxiety and guilt that goes with this about, are they doing the right thing to make their child better than, it's not quite clear better than what, but the subtext is better than all those other children. And that picture is totally different from the picture that comes out of the science and that I was reading about and writing about in the context of the science. Now, does science say that caregivers and parents matter? Absolutely. As we'll see, they matter absolutely more than anything else that we do as human beings. But the role that parents and caregivers play is quite different from that sort of carpentry role, especially for very young children up to the age of 5. And a metaphor that I think captures what the science says much better is to think about caregivers as being like gardeners. If you're like me, at least as a gardener, nothing ever comes out the way that you plant. You plant one thing and something totally different comes up and your best plans are frustrated, and then the best things that happen in the garden are the unexpected things. Now, that's sort of true just qua gardeners, but there's actually a deeper biological reason for that. And that is that what you do when you're a gardener is to create an ecosystem. So what you could think of what you do as a gardener is you're putting in a lot of work and energy, you're up to your neck in manure a lot of the time, the way you are when you're a parent. And what you do is create a safe, sheltered, protected place in which many, many different kinds of plants can flourish in an unexpected way, in which you can have lots of diversity. And one of the things that we've learned in evolutionary biology is that although it might seem like a good idea to try to take that potato and make it the biggest, fattest, most protected potato you possibly could imagine, it turns out that's not a good idea. That's not a good way to have agriculture or gardening that's going to be resilient. So what is it that having that very varied, unpredictable ecosystem does? It lets you have resilience. It lets you change in the light of changing seasons or the changing weather. And what I argue in the book, and I'm going to argue talking to you a bit today, is that the same thing is true about caregiving. That the point about caregiving, especially for the 0 to 5 set, is not to create a child who has particular characteristics. It's to give the child a safe space in which we can have a kind of ecosystem of child development in which children can do many new unexpected things. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So to go back to the evolutionary story that kind of got me here in the first place, one of the big puzzles from a scientific perspective about children is why we have children in the first place. Not the obvious answer that you probably here have all figured out, But why is it that we have such a long period of childhood? Why do our children depend on us so much for so long? And it's really, if you were a biologist just trying to look at the evolution of human beings, the first thing that would hit you is we have this incredibly long childhood. So even if you compare us to our closest primate relatives, like chimpanzees, like, oops, get the slide. Do you have the slide showing up? Yeah. Like this adorable young chimpanzee, by the time chimpanzees are 7 years old, they're producing as much food as they're consuming. And in hunter-gatherer societies, even in hunter-gatherer societies, they're not doing that until they're 15. And my son is 29, and in our society, we can still be paying rent checks when they're 29. Why would that be? Why would we see this really long period when children depend on us so much, when we have to put so much time and energy into them? And why was that one of the things that really seems to have evolved as we became humans? Well, it turns out that if you look across many different kinds of animals, you see this really interesting correlation between how long a childhood you have, how big a brain you have, and how smart you are. So sort of the poster animals for this are you can find among the birds, that's a New Caledonian crow. And crows and ravens and corvids are incredibly smart animals. That's a crow who's using a hook to get some food. On the other hand, on the other side is our friend the domestic chicken. And chickens are basically dumb as stumps. So chickens are very good at pecking for grain, and they're very good at pecking for grain pretty much from the time they're born. They're not very good at learning to do anything new. And you see this relationship, this correlation between how smart the adult is. And chickens are mature within a couple of weeks. The crows are fledglings for a year. These New Caledonian crows are fledglings for as long as 2 years, which is really long in the life of an animal. So there seems to be this really strong relationship between how smart the adults are and how long a period of immaturity the children have. And as I'll say a little bit later on, the best explanation for that is that animals like crows are designed not so much to thrive in one particular environment, the way chickens are. They're designed to learn about many different new environments. So you can plunk a New Caledonian crow in a lab with a piece of wire it's never seen before. It figures out what to do with that piece of wire. So it depends on learning. And depending on learning is a really good strategy. It lets you be resilient. It lets you deal with new environments. But it has one big drawback, which is that until you do that learning, you're going to be helpless. So the idea is that young animals are designed for learning. That's literally what babies and children are for. They're for learning. What we do as caregivers is to give them a protected period in which they can do all the learning that they're going to put into action later on as adults. And what goes along with that is that in addition to having this longer childhood, as you might expect, the smarter animals also have more parental investment. They have more adults involved in caring for them. So here's another example of this relationship. These are the world's cutest animals. These are marsupials who live in Australia. That animal on that side is the quokka. And quokkas, babies, stay in the pouch for about 2 years. And the quokkas are taken care of not only by their biological mother, but by their biological father and by other adult quokkas in the group. In contrast, next to them is the Virginia opossum. And possums have 9 or 10 babies at a go. They're taken care of only by the mother, and they're mature within a couple of months. So now I think if you're a human mother, you may often feel more like the mother possum than you feel like the mother quokka. I think we could all use more backlighting in our lives. But it turns out that the quokkas have brains that are twice as big as the brains of the possums, even though they're the same size. And of course, if you think about human beings, we're way off on the end of the distribution in terms of how big our brains are, how flexible we are, how much we depend on learning, how smart we are compared to other animals. And it turns out we're also really distinctive in terms of our investment in those babies. So if you look again at our closest primate relatives, like the chimpanzees, basically chimp biological mothers take care of the babies until the babies are pretty much capable of taking care of themselves. And that's true for most of primate relatives. But human beings, just in the brief period where we evolved away from our common ancestor with the chimps, developed what I think of as the triple threat of caregiving. So not only are biological mothers caring for the babies, but we have pair bonding. So we have both fathers and mothers involved in care for the baby, and we've had that for as long as we've been human. Now, we might just sort of take that for granted. Well, of course fathers are going to be involved in taking care of babies. But that's true for less than 5% of all the species of mammals. And it's not true for any of our other close primate relatives. So it's really distinctive that we have pair-bonded fathers who are helping to take care of babies. And by the way, that's my son and my grandson that you just saw in that picture. So fathers are making this big contribution. Another thing that we have that's really distinctive is we have what the great anthropologist Sarah Hrdy calls alloparents, which means that people who are not biologically related to babies are still involved in caring for babies. And again, that's very distinctive. We don't see it in our closest relatives like chimps, but it's been true for as long as we've been human. So an interesting new paper that came out looked at hunter-gatherer societies, particular hunter-gatherer society, and found that babies on average were breastfed by 4 different women in the course of a week in the community. So the idea that people who are not biological kin help to take care of babies, that's not just an invention in the late 20th century. That's something that's been true about us for as long as we've been human. And there's a lot of arguments that actually both helped young humans to figure out how to do caregiving, a really important point, that alloparenting gave you a chance to figure out how to care for children, and also that contribution actually enabled us to have this long childhood, which enabled us to grow these big brains, enabled us to learn so much, enabled us to be as smart as we are as adults. And then the last part of my triple threat, and my favorite, is grandmothers. So if you look very carefully behind those 3 incredibly beautiful, adorable children, you will see a grandmother lurking in the background. And it turns out that grandmothers are also really distinctive. Human beings are the only primate that outlives their fertility. And again, you might think, well, maybe that's because we have good nutrition. It's been true as long as we've been around. So if you look in forager cultures, women are living to be 60 or 70. Chimps are dying when they're 50, when they reach menopause. Why would that be? From an evolutionary perspective, it seems really paradoxical. Why keep women around so long when they're not reproducing anymore? Sort of something that will echo in this room, I expect. Well, it turns out, this is again beautiful work by the anthropologist Kristen Hawkes. It turns out that grandmothers are actually providing more nutrition and support for the babies than anyone else in the community. And especially when babies get weaned when they're about 2, the grandmothers are the ones who are doing the caregiving. So the grandmothers are the ones who really enable us to have this very long period available to us for learning, because the grandmothers are contributing to it as well as the grandfathers. The grandfathers are sort of less evolutionarily weird, but both grandmothers and grandfathers are helping to contribute to the welfare of children. And Kristen Hawkes argues that it was the evolution of grandmothers was what let us become human, or one of the things in any case that let us become human. Okay, so what is all this investment doing? Why do we have so many people, and always have for human beings, so involved in just taking care of children? Well, I said before when I was talking about the crows, the story seems to be that this early period gives us a time to learn. And if we look at brain development, we see very much the same thing. So this is a chart of the number of connection synapses that are being formed at various stages of development. And what you can see is that early on, between 0 and 5, the brain's making many, many, many new connections. So it's making new connections all the time. And what happens at various points for different parts of the brain is that the connections that are used a lot get strengthened, they get stronger, they get more efficient, they get more effective. The connections that aren't used get pruned, they get cut away, get lost. And what that means is that there's a real difference between this early brain, which is designed to learn. It's designed to be what neuroscientists call plastic, flexible, respond to new information about the environment. And then this later adult brain that's designed to be very, very good at doing things. It's very good at actually getting around in the world and, putting on your jacket to get to preschool in the morning. Adults are a lot better at that kind of thing than 3-year-olds are. Not as good at learning. Not as good, especially, at learning to deal with something that's new. And here's one of my favorite slides, speaking of the biology. This is a marvelous new study that just came out a few years ago. As you may know, as you're sitting here now having lunch, your brain is using up 20% of the calories that you're consuming. It always felt to me like if you were thinking really deep thoughts, you should be able to consume more calories, but that doesn't turn out to be true. It's just sitting there. Brains are really expensive, energy-guzzling gadgets, and they use up a lot of energy. So the question was, what's the developmental course of that? And it turns out that when you're 4 years old, your brain is using 66% of all of your calories. I think this is a wonderful fact. So my beautiful 4-year-old grandson, Augie, is basically like a creature out of Doctor Who or a science fiction story, where he's just basically this giant hungry brain out in the world, trying to get nourishment, put on this little body that's very good at hypnotizing everybody and turning them into his slaves to get his brain fed more and more and more. That's a pretty good picture of what a 4-year-old is like. What is all this brain power in aid of, right? So those grandmothers are out there digging roots to keep this incredibly hungry 4-year-old brain going. And what that energy is doing is making all those new synapses, making all that those new connections, doing all that new learning. And it turns out that when you look at the trigger for human evolution, why was it that, I've already said in a relatively short time, humans changed a lot. We got these enormous brains. We got this very long childhood. We got this big parental investment. What was there in the world that made us change so quickly and so massively? And one of the best hypotheses now is that our environment became unpredictable. So this is actually a graph that shows you the climate variability as we evolved. And you can see that what happened wasn't so much that the climate got warmer or got colder, it was that it got unpredictable. So it would shift from warm to cold much more quickly. And at least a prevailing idea is that it was that environmental variability that was the cue for human evolution. So what we evolved to do is to deal with the unknown unknowns. That's our niche. Chickens, pecking grain, us, the unknown. That's really what we evolved to deal with. We evolved to deal with very unpredictable environments. And there's a whole lot of other reasons why our environments are unpredictable, or are particularly unpredictable as well. And again, anyone who's a human being will recognize that our environment can change very quickly in a very short period of time. So it seems as if what happened was that we developed this long period of childhood so that we could adapt to rapidly shifting, rapidly changing environments. And the picture is well captured, I think, by an idea that also comes from neuroscience, which is a difference between exploring and exploiting. And it turns out that if you have a problem to solve, there's 2 different ways you could solve it. You could just try and solve it by looking very close to where you already are, just changing a little bit of what you're doing to try to solve that problem. Or you could solve it by trying something completely new, completely different, totally out of the box. And in neuroscience and computer science, what they've discovered is the best way to solve that, so there's a kind of trade-off, because if you just change things a little, you might get to a pretty good solution pretty quickly, but you might miss a much better solution that's much further away from where you are now. On the other hand, if you're spending all your time off there in this crazy R&D thinking out of the box world, then you're not going to be able to deal with the thing that's happening right away. And in neuroscience and in computer science and machine learning, the way that they deal with that is by having an early period where you get to explore, you get to just figure out what's the space of the problem, what are the potentials, what's the possibility, and then a later period where you narrow in on particular kinds of solutions. And one of the things that we've argued is that you could think about childhood as being evolution's way of solving that explore-exploit problem. It's a way of giving us a time early on when we can try out things that are crazy and new and different from what we've done before. We can get into a new environment with something that no human being has ever seen before, and we can figure out how to cope with that new environment. Now, again, if that's true, and this is where my research comes in, we would expect to find that children would be really, really, really good learners. And in fact, that's what developmental psychology has found. And what we found is that they're particularly good at learning unexpected, unusual, new things. But the way that they learn is through their everyday observation and play. And I think this is something that intuitively lots of people in early childhood know, but it's really been demonstrated in really dramatic ways in developmental psychology. So my first book was called The Scientist in the Crib, and I argued that children were like little scientists. I am amazed every month at the new study that comes out that shows that not only are they scientists, but they're analyzing conditional probabilities, and they're working out graphical interfaces, and they're doing all that just looking at the world around them and playing with the things that they see. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. So here's an experiment. How could you find out that these very young children are good at doing things like analyzing statistics? After all, most grown-ups are terrible at analyzing statistics. Well, the way that we do it is not by trying to give them a statistics test. What we do is we give them this very simple little box that's called a Blicket detector. The Blicket detector is a box that lights up and plays music when you put some things on it, namely Blickets, but not others. And what we can do with this very simple device is we can show the children all sorts of complicated patterns of evidence about how the machine works. And then instead of asking the children, did you infer that 4-part causal chain from those conditional probabilities, we say, can you make the machine go? And we see what they do to actually make the machine go. This is work with my graduate student, Chris Lucas. So now, this is a tough thing to spring on you after lunch and a sleepless night, but you guys can get to be subjects in this experiment. So here's a Blicket detector. Here's a block, D. As you'll see, these are all different shapes and colors in the experiment that I put on the detector. The detector doesn't light up 3 times when I put D on it. Now I put D and E, then I put E on, nothing happens. Then I put D and F on twice together, and the machine lights up both times. So now the question for you is D a Blicket? No. Okay, great. Is E a Blicket? Is F a Blicket? Okay. We have some people who have been hanging around, obviously, with 4-year-olds here. Because, as I might expect, this crowd is actually a little smarter than our Berkeley undergraduates, and maybe almost as smart as the 4-year-olds. Because what if you also saw this sequence of events? So you saw A and B and C each does not make the machine go. A and B together don't. B and C together don't, but A and C together do. What you might think is, oh, I get it. I thought this machine worked the obvious way, individual blocks make it go or not. This machine actually works an unusual way. You have to put a combination of blocks on to make it go. So you have to have A and C together to make it go. Neither one will work by itself. That's a much less obvious, much more unusual way for a machine to work. So, but if you saw that sequence of events and you went back to the sequence that I showed you in the first place, you might change your mind. You might think, oh, wait a minute, if this machine works in that unusual combination way, maybe it's actually both D and F that are Blickets. Maybe you need more than one thing to make it go. So what we did was we did exactly the experiment I just showed to you with both 4-year-olds and Berkeley undergraduates. And what we did was we either gave them in training on that on the obvious individual assumption or the unlikely combination assumption. And then we just gave them exactly the same test that we gave you. And I'm going to, again, to make us all, cheer us all up, here is, oops, can we get the sound? Okay, so I like showing this video just because it's a cute child, it makes everybody happy. But also because if you're like most people, when you were watching this, you were thinking to yourself, what was going on there? Was it the triangle was putting on and then it was the square one? It's hard to track this, so don't be embarrassed if you weren't tracking what was going on. It's hard to track even for adults. But that little 4-year-old was paying attention and figured out the right solution. And what we found was that when we tested both 4-year-olds and adults, they got it right in the obvious case. In the non-obvious case, the 4-year-olds got it right. The adults just went with the thing that was the most obvious solution. So the 4-year-olds were much better at figuring out something that was unusual or unlikely than the adults were. And interestingly, the real inflection point for this seems to be adolescence. We've been doing this with adolescents, very depressing. So you see the big drop is about 12 to 14. So these, and again, I think anybody who's had, your 2-year-old explain how your smartphone works to you will kind of recognize that that's true. Something like a touch interface that seems really weird and strange for someone old like me is just kind of obvious as far as a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old is concerned. Now, how does that kind of everyday learning through observing interact with the kind of learning that we think of as the kind of carpenter school model of learning? So to test that, we did another experiment. This time what we did was we showed children this toy, another one of our simple devices. And this toy will play music if you squish it, and you squeeze the bulb, and you pull the ring. So the kids see that. And then we show them that you can pull the handle and squeeze the bulb and pull the ring. And the machine will also play music. So we show them 10 different patterns of different kinds of actions and different kinds of outcomes. And what those different patterns should tell you, like the one that I just showed you, is, well, maybe you don't actually have to do all 3 things to make the machine play music. Maybe all you have to do is squeeze the ball and pull the ring. So you don't actually have to do all 3. If you were an intelligent, like machine learning computer, you'd figure out that, no, I don't have to imitate everything the person did. I just have to imitate the things that are really going to be effective, the last 2. So what we did was we showed 4-year-olds these complicated patterns. And again, let me show you what this looks like. Okay, so she goes on and does that 10 more times. And here's what the little boy does. So even though he never saw her demonstrate that intelligence solution, he figured it out. Now, as you may have noticed, she was very good at being clueless in that first experiment. She said, I don't know how this works, let's find out. We did exactly the same experiment. The only difference is now she says, this is my toy, I'm going to show you how it works. When we did that, the 4-year-olds never figured out what the solution was. Never. I mean, there's a 0 on that if I were to show you the graph. So ironically, trying to teach more actually narrowed the range of possibilities that the children would consider. And we've actually found this phenomenon in other studies as well. So another really important way that children learn is through playing. And again, we all kind of take it for granted, yeah, children learn through playing. But there hasn't actually been great evidence for that until relatively recently, and I talk about that in a chapter or two in the new book. My postdoc and ex-graduate student now at MIT did a really nice study looking at this. What they did was they showed the children a new toy that could do 4 different things. It had a squeaker that could squeak, it had a light that could light up, it had a mirror you could look at, and it could play music. And what they did was to just show the children this new toy. So she accidentally bumps it and it squeaks. Okay, so what she does, as you'd expect with any 4-year-old who you gave a cool new toy to, is she plays with it and she finds the mirror and she squeaks the squeaker and she looks some more and figures out where the music is. And by the end of the tape, she's basically figured out all the different things that the toy can do. But now, suppose you introduce the toy in a slightly different way. So now she says, I'm going to show you my toy. And she squeaks the squeaker. Okay, and I could play that to you for another 3 minutes, and you wouldn't see anything except pushing that squeaker. So the children, even these very young children, these 4-year-olds, are already incredibly sensitive to really fine details about how caregivers are interacting with them. And when they think that caregivers are trying to teach them in a kind of direct way, kind of rationally, they think, okay, well, that's a context in which I should just do what the adults are doing. And sometimes that can be a good thing. But it narrows down the thing that's most distinctive about the young children, which is this wide-ranging exploration. The wide-ranging exploration, this wide-ranging explore attitude, this way of thinking about possibilities that you see in both the way that children learn through looking, through just observing the way that people around them are washing dishes and doing things and using tools, and also the way that children learn through just playing with the everyday things that are going on that they have around them. So what the science is telling us is that caregivers are caring so that children can explore. So the effect of the caregiving is it's giving children this rich environment in which there's lots of things to explore, lots of caring adults, lots of resources, and lots of adults who can be there to give you the information when you need it, but not try to shape you to come out a particular way. So this is part of why I think the science supports this garden picture much more than the kind of carpentry picture, which is not only the picture of parenting, but the picture of, say, most K through 12 kind of education. Now, let me go back to the point about taking a village. So if this is true, is there a way, is there something we could point to that would be the ideal context, the ideal circumstance for this kind of learning to take place? How in a modern non-forager society could we create this kind of rich garden? And actually, you know, the story is that we figured this out about 100 years ago. So there's a reason why kindergarten is called kindergarten, which is that that's German for a child's garden. And this piece of video, which I'll just play as I'm finishing up, is this amazing movie that I discovered recently, a silent movie that's from 1928 from the Harold Jones Child Study Center at Berkeley. And what you can see is that even in 1928, people had a very good idea about how young children would be able to thrive. And they had very good pictures of what a preschool for children would be like. So there's a caring adult, and she's singing, and she's talking to the kids. And then, as you'll see in a minute, the kids all get dressed, and they go out to the garden, and there are ducks that they play with. They play silly games. They sing. At one point, they actually have a hammer and nails, much to my shock, as I kept thinking, oh, they won't get past licensing with that, for sure. Yeah, there they are. They're building and putting things together and climbing. And we have lots of models, and they're so adorable, because it's 1928. They all have those 1928 haircuts. I find it incredibly touching to think that if these children are alive, they're in their 90s now. But I'll bet you they remember and were influenced by this early experience. So we have lots of evidence. We have lots of examples of what that kind of context should look like. We have things like the Child Study Centers. We have things like the Reggio Emilia program. We have lots of examples. We know what a good, rich preschool should look like, or better, a good, rich child's garden rather than preschool. And it's sort of funny that the word childcare has come to be sort of a dirty word, and we'd much prefer to say preschool, as if we only care for children because then they'll get into school later on, right? Yeah, I like the goose who's coming in and joining in on the water fountain. Licensing would probably give them a hard time about that too. But of course, the painful reality at the moment is, instead of having this model that we know, and by the way, that we know from social science works, and extending it to as many children as we possibly can, instead, what we've tended to do is to take the schooling model, that very peculiar model that came in the late 19th century, and push it further and further back into earlier and earlier into education. So that instead of making schools more like preschools, which is what the science would tell you, what we're doing is making preschools more and more like schools. And we're doing that in the context of early childhood education, and we're also doing it as parents in the context of parenting. So we're treating this early period, which is intended to be a period of wide-ranging play, exploration, looking, observing, trying out all sorts of new things, we treat it more and more as if it should really be like the kind of activities that we see in school. So we actually know what makes sense from a scientific perspective, and in some way of sense, we've known this for 100 years now. We can see it in children's natural development in hunter-gatherer societies, for example. And the puzzle is, how is it that we can actually get the resources to make it work? So if you look in those forager societies, back when we evolved, evolution knew that having mothers and fathers and alloparents and caregivers and grandmothers who all had enough resources and food and space and time to be with the children, that was the thing that was going to allow human beings to flourish. That was the thing that would let us learn and know and understand the world. And now we're in a world that's more variable, more unpredictable than it ever was before. We need those skills of creativity and imagination more than we ever did before, not less than we ever did before. And the worry is that the pressure is actually going in the opposite direction, that instead of encouraging and celebrating the things that I think preschool teachers and others have known all along, what we're doing is moving in the other direction. And we move in the other direction in both ways. 20% of children, as everyone in this room knows, in America are growing up in poverty, so they don't have those kinds of resources. And even when we provide the resources, preschool teachers are often placed in this kind of pincer movement between the parents who want their kids to go to Harvard and the policymakers who are insisting that the kids do well on a test to show that the investment was actually worthwhile. And that goes, to get back to how I started, that goes completely against the kind of picture that we see from the science. So I'll stop there, let you look at those adorable 100-year-old children a little more, and take some questions. I guess, are there mics for, looking where? Yeah, there's a mic, some mics for questions, or people can just shout, yeah? Oh. Yeah, both of those things are true. So we've just been, the center's gone through a lot of changes as early childhood has, but no, it's still very much got that idea, particularly in California, of there's as much room outside as there is inside. So instead of thinking of it as recess, children go always perpetually going back and forth the way they are here between outside where they're playing and exploring and inside. And that's where we do all of our research. Those are all the children that we actually, study. What we're trying to do now, by the way, in Berkeley is to try and have that in Berkeley be a kind of model center for early childhood. So one of the things that's very frustrating is the university system, and the UC system has the best developmental psychologists in the world, and we're not using them to train our early childhood educators. So we've just started the first undergraduate program in early childhood education at Berkeley. And that's what we really need to do. We really need to leverage that expertise to enable those things to happen. Yeah, Delane.
What countries did you see in your travels? In your travels, what countries do you think are the closest to having a model that the United States or California should be following?
Well, a very good example that people talk about a lot is Finland.
1, 2, check.
And it was interesting when I was just in Scotland. There's a movement now in Scotland to try to change the Scottish pre-K system into a Finnish system. So in Finland, what happens is there's this 7-year period. So sort of 0 to 7 is this early exploratory period. And then at 7, you start having things that are more school-like. And that kind of fits with what the science is telling us about these changes that are happening, if you remember that chart, around 6 or 7, sort of turning that early brain into a later brain. And in Scotland, they're now trying to change the system so that you have this extended period all the way to 7. I was telling Delane before, I was also in Ireland, and I said, you know, well, it's great, you have all state-supported early childhood education. And they said, oh, no, we don't. It's actually terrible. People have to put together, we have a little state money, but people have to put it together. And they said, it's not till 18 months that you actually have universal support for early childhood education. And I said, oh, yeah, okay, you guys don't know what it's like elsewhere. So I think the Finnish system, which ends up, even though children aren't learning to read until they're 7, they end up with the best scores among adults. The Reggio Emilia system in Italy is a lovely example and has been a lovely example of this for a long time. And again, those are programs that are universal. Poor children are as involved in those programs as wealthier middle-class children are. And in fact, you know, almost every place else in the world has some kind of supported and well-supported preschool that has these kinds of features. In the back? Yeah. Turn the mic on.
The policy questions that you raised in this presentation being played out in sort of the education policy development here in our country?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think some of these ideas are being acknowledged more and more. I think there's a real kind of backlash against the move to have more and more testing and more structure earlier and earlier. It's a kind of interesting for me as a scientist, because I was saying part of the reason why we haven't had a lot of evidence about play is that the things that this early exploration and play are good for, which are things like creativity, innovation, dealing with something new, are very hard to test, right? So it's very hard to have a test that says, can you deal with something completely unprecedented that I, as the test designer, would never have thought of, right? So one of the challenges is to try and figure out how we can, how can we show that this works without thinking about it in the context of standardized testing. And of course, another big issue is just child poverty. One of the things that we've done recently that I'm actually very excited about is we've gone into Head Start programs and started looking at how children there are solving these kinds of problems. And you know, that really complicated, you know, A, B, and C, that the kids are doing better than the undergrads, the Head Start kids are doing that too. So the Head Start kids are, when they're 3 or 4, they're showing potential for the same kind of creativity and innovation that the middle class kids are showing. And the question is, so we have the basis there to help those kids if we provided them with the same kind of support that the middle class children are getting. So you know, you guys are the policy makers, but I think the idea that early childhood, and particularly this kind of exploratory early childhood, scientifically really is significant and important. And you know, in some ways I sort of feel like, well, we should know that this is important because we're human, but it might help as a selling point to say, for those of us here in California, these are exactly the skills that we need in a place like Silicon Valley. And it's no coincidence, you mentioned my husband from Pixar, it's no coincidence that Pixar has lots of places for their employees to play, has playrooms. And Google gives people a day off that they can just explore, where they can just explore new possibilities. So, you know, maybe those school direct instruction model worked when you were literally trying to make people into robots who could work in factories. I mean, in the sense that you were getting people to do things in factories that are now being done by robots. But it really doesn't make sense in a context where being able to deal with the unexpected, the novel, being able to be innovative and creative is more important than it ever was before, not less important. Now, as I say, I sort of feel like you should say, well, for heaven's sake, you should take care of 3-year-olds because you're a human being, and we all take care of 3-year-olds not because we think that they're going to get us better apps 30 years from now in the Valley, but you know, I'll use any argument I can get. Yeah.
Mike over here.
So thanks for that phenomenal presentation. I think it puts a lot of context behind our workforce and how we're training our teachers and those that work with our youngest children in our action. It's not what we say, it's how we say it. It's not the toy, but how we introduce it to the children. So with knowing that teaching is both an art and a science, how do we get back to more practical experiences for our workforce when they're going through their practicum courses to really focus on those interactive features to ensure that we get back to we learn through play. And I think with a lot of this push-down effect of, which I'm a huge fan of all of the phenomenal assessment tools, environment ratings when used appropriately, but how do we not get to the robotic state of teaching? Because the more I get into classrooms and do a lot of observations, we've gotten very robotic with our way of interacting with one another, the way we interact with children. And I also find it very peculiar that our workforce that is currently teaching the children today in the 0 to 5 population, they didn't have that early learning experience as well. So they're kind of lacking those human skill sets to even know what that looks like. What does real good interaction look like that stimulates curiosity?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And I do think, you know, I was also sort of puzzled about, okay, where does this Carpenter model come from? And I think a lot of it comes from why did it start showing up in the end of the 20th century? And what happened was that as we got more mobile, smaller families, people having children older, that network that the quokkas have of Ella parents and grandparents and an extended family, where both you had a wide range of people who all loved the kids and were all invested in taking care of them, and also you had people having the experience of caregiving. So older siblings are another part of that parental investment. So for most of human history, by the time you had children yourself, you'd had extensive experience both taking care of children yourself and watching a wide range of other people take care of children. I have my introductory Berkeley developmental class. I asked them, how many of you have ever taken care of a child? And you'd be amazed. Like, it's much less than half of the class who've ever had that experience as 20-year-olds. And of course, that's exacerbated for the early childhood workforce, where very often the conditions of children in poverty is that they have like a third of a single biological mother who's actually invested in caregiving. So what we're trying to do at Berkeley, for instance, is to have, and I think it's not that hard, it's to have people learning the way that they did for most of history. Be in a room with a bunch of people who are doing this well and interact with the kids, let the kids teach you what sort of things are going to work and what sort of things aren't going to work. That, have master teachers. Those are the things that I think are really the effective means of instruction, and that's kind of what we're trying to do at Berkeley. But of course, also having a decent wage would help a lot in terms of being able to do this. And again, I want to emphasize, you know, you look in these hunter-gatherer forager communities, you know, these are people that are just barely getting by. They invest all that expertise of all those adults into taking care of their children. And as I say, evolution recognized that this is a good investment, even if we don't seem to be able to realize it now.
I think we have time for one more. Do we have one more question? One more? Right over there.
Yeah, there we go.
It's right over there.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Hi, I work primarily with families who have children with disabilities, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what you've talked about in this application in this case.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, because get back to that garden metaphor about an ecosystem. So one of the things that there's actually really fascinating evolutionary work about is that part of the way we evolved to deal with these unknown unknowns was to have a lot of diversity. So a lot of cognitive diversity. And there's actually nice models that show that by having lots of different people with different skills and weaknesses, we can do better in the long run than if we just, and again, this is like the potato, you know, versus the organic garden, right? We actually do better because we don't quite know what things are going to be significant or not. And one of the things that's happened in the schooling model is that you end up with sort of two categories. Either there's normal children, or else there's sick children. And you take all that cognitive diversity that we know is part of how we evolved, and you put it into these two, I think, very reductive categories. So the thing that, again, you'd think would be good for moral purposes, which is celebrating the diversity in the way that human beings are and giving people lots of opportunities to thrive in the ways that suit those individual people. That sounds like motherhood, but motherhood sometimes has to be described. The interesting thing is that I don't think we just need to do that for moral purposes. I think from an evolutionary perspective, that's again exactly the way that we've managed to thrive for all those years. So if you look at human history, there have been lots of times when cognitive skills that we value now would have been useless, and cognitive styles that we think are problematic now would have been incredibly helpful. And our job really should be to try and kind of get a fit between what the children are like and what their environment is like, rather than saying, okay, there's normal kids, there's sick kids, we'll figure out how to cure the sick kids.
We actually have time for a couple more.
Okay, great. Good. If there's anybody else who has questions.
I'm very interested in this instinct for exploration, and I think it's great that you're talking about it. Have you thought about how it applies to technology?
Yeah.
And children exploring through technology and maybe even being more, have an affinity for STEM, et cetera, by early letting them do that? Have you done work in that area as well?
Yep, there's a chapter in the book about technology too. And of course, there's a lot of anxiety now about children and technology, and a lot of pessimism about it. I don't think that the science really supports that. I think a lot of that, I don't think the science supports it, and I don't think history supports it. So a way I sometimes put this is, I actually spent all my childhood with this incredibly powerful optic interface device that took your brain and put it in an alternative reality. And I was so absorbed in it that I would not pay attention to anything else going on around me. I ignored the other people around me. And then when I became an adult, I wouldn't stir out of the house unless I had my device with me in every possible room of the house. And that, of course, is the book. And Socrates actually pointed out the dangers of this device. So Socrates said, if people read books, they're not going to remember anything. No one will know Homer by heart anymore. And they won't be in a dialogue, because you'll think the things that you read in books are true. And Socrates, of course, was completely right. Nobody knows all of Homer anymore. But we feel like the trade-offs of that were worth it. So I think the general sort of sensible picture now is each generation, this is part of the evolutionary story, each generation is dealing with a new environment and creating new environments, and technology is a deep part of it. And again, if you see something like a 3-year-old who knows how to use the smartphone so much better than you do, you can recognize that. On the other hand, I think the recommendations, the recent revised recommendations of the American Academy of Pediatrics, which sort of started out being, oh no, we have to keep kids away from screens. The recommendation is, yeah, it's part of what your life is like, and you get children to figure out a diet of media or technology the same way that you get them to have a healthy diet of food, rather than thinking of it as being like a poison that you have to keep them away from. So my mom wouldn't let me read books at the table. I won't let Hoggy look at screens at the table. But I think that's a much saner and also less anxiety-provoking view. And part of what I hope that this book in general will do for parents is to say, be both reassuring and liberating, because I think one of the effects of the sense that there's these terrible things that are out there that are damaging our children is to instill a lot of anxiety and guilt in parents that isn't really necessary, and that messes up the process of caregiving. It's hard to do the kinds of things you see in that garden when you're feeling stressed and anxious and guilty about whether you're doing the right thing.
Listening to you talk about teaching and that word coming up, I'm thinking almost that hearing what you said and seeing this, we should be reflecting on the learning that is occurring, and not on the teaching process. And that may be where we're kind of going wrong. We're trying to push down teaching techniques or structure further and further, as opposed to opening up into a garden for learning.
Yeah,
So-
yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think that's exactly right, and in a way, I think what the science shows us is that children, and as I say, we're finding this now with children in Peru, with children in Head Start. The learning abilities are in there, and they're more powerful and more impressive than anything that we could ever have imagined. I mean, you let a 4-year-old's brain loose on a rich environment with people who care about them, they're gonna learn. I mean, that's what they're really designed for. So we don't have to make them learn, we just have to let them learn. And we have to let them learn by letting the environment be the curriculum, as people in preschool say, by putting them in in these rich environments. So I think exactly the model that is the schooling 19th century model is this model in which what we have to do is take someone in the Carpenter model is we have to teach them, we have to do a bunch of things to them to get them to be the right kind of chair. And the model that comes out of the science is that the children are, and I think this is literally true, human children under the age of 5 are the best learners we know of in the universe. There's nothing else, not the fanciest machines down in Silicon Valley, nothing else can match them. And what we really have to do is harness that learning ability. It's not that we have these blank slates and we have to go in there and shape them so that they can know the things that they need to know.
One last one? Yeah, right.
I would love to hear your thoughts about connecting where you started, that the caring helps children learn, with what you were just saying about how sort of teaching interferes with kids' learning.
Right.
And help us understand sort of more of the balance between those two.
Right. So again, what the interesting thing that comes out of the research is that parents and other caregivers sort of intuitively shape what they do to give children the kinds of information they need. And children are very good at intuitively picking up on the subtle details of what caregivers are doing and figuring out what kind of information they're trying to convey. So that seems to be sort of that interaction, a nice way I like to think of it is as a kind of dance between, a duet between the children who are out there pulling things from you and then the caregivers who are out there providing lots of information and values to the children. And I think the important point is, at least up till 5, or probably more like up till 6 or 7, what the children are learning about are things like the values that the people around them have, and the tools that the people around them use, and the things that are important to the people around them. And I think there's an argument to be made that they do that better by just being with people who have those values, who use those tools, and who do all of that in the context of childhood, rather than being in the context of what we typically think of as teaching. So, you know, my favorite personal example of this is cooking with a 3-year-old. And if you look in those forager societies, they're making tortillas when they're 2. And again, they're, from our perspective, rather alarmingly, you know, that children are, there's a recent study that came out describing children skinning small animals that are actually too small to eat very much of, but the children are sitting there skinning them and preparing them as food when they're 3 years old. Now, I can bet you, as a grandmother who makes pancakes with her grandchildren every Sunday, that the parents are sort of thinking a little bit, you know, I think I could really skin these animals a lot faster if I didn't actually have the children in there helping me. But what happens spontaneously in these cultures is you slow down. You show the child, look, this is what I'm doing. This is how the eggs work, and this is how the flour works. And now you do it. Oh, okay, the eggs ended up on the floor there. That's, I think, a really good example of the way that the children are learning through observing, and then the adults are modifying what they do to try and teach them. And again, this is going to be preaching to the choir to anybody who's a good preschool teacher. That's what the best, if you go out and you observe what the great preschool teachers, or for that matter, what, you know, the great abuelas are doing, the great grandmothers are doing, and that's the sort of thing that you're going to see. I mean, it's a difficult question because we want training, obviously, for our early childhood teachers, but I think we may have a lot of resources that we're not really taking advantage of in people like the grandmothers that are still around, in people who've had long experience with children and understood children, rather than, say, going to do a BA program. So what we want to do is try and figure out a way we're not in a hunter-gatherer culture anymore. We're in this post-industrial, mobile culture. What's a way that we can design institutions that will do the same sort of things that we know biologically children and caregivers were designed to do? I think that's the policy challenge.
Please join me in thanking